If you're going to pretend to be mine tonight, don't flinch when they try to break you. The words still echoed in Lily Carter's mind as the massive oak doors slowly opened in front of her, revealing a wedding that looked less like a celebration and more like a display of power, the kind she had only ever seen through the glass windows of places she couldn't afford to step into. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead, casting soft golden light across polished marble floors, and everywhere she looked, people moved with effortless confidence, dressed in gowns that probably cost more than her rent for a year. Lily swallowed, her fingers tightening slightly around the small clutch Ethan had insisted she carry, her reflection briefly catching in the mirrored panel beside the entrance. Same girl, same nervous eyes, just wrapped in a dress that didn't feel like hers. "Stay close," Ethan Cole murmured beside her, his voice calm, controlled, like none of this fazed him, like walking into his ex's wedding with a stranger on his arm was just another item on his schedule. He didn't look at her when he said it, but his hand shifted just enough at her waist to guide her forward, subtle, practiced, possessive in a way that made every head turn before they even took 5 steps inside. The room noticed him instantly. Of course they did. People like Ethan didn't enter quietly. They arrived, and the air adjusted. Conversations faltered. Eyes lingered. And then, just as quickly, those same eyes slid to Lily. Measuring, questioning, judging. She felt it all without anyone saying a word. Who is she? Where did he find her? Is this a joke? Her heels clicked softly against the floor, each step louder in her head than it should have been, her heart keeping pace like it was trying to outrun the moment. This was a mistake. She didn't belong here. She didn't belong next to him. But then she remembered the way he had looked at her in that small coffee shop just hours earlier. No hesitation, no explanation, just that one quiet sentence. "Come with me." And somehow, she had said yes. A server passed by with champagne flutes, and Lily instinctively stepped aside, but Ethan didn't let go. "You're not invisible tonight," he said under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear. "So don't act like you are." She straightened slightly, not because she suddenly felt confident, but because something in his tone didn't sound like a command. It sounded like a warning. At the far end of the room, near an arch draped in white roses, the bride stood laughing with a group of elegantly dressed guests, radiant, flawless, completely unaware that the past she thought was buried had just walked back into the room. Or maybe she did know, because the second her eyes lifted and locked onto Ethan, her smile froze. Not faded, not softened, froze. And then, slowly, her gaze shifted to Lily, scanning her from head to toe with a precision that felt sharper than any insult. Lily felt her breath catch, her instincts screaming to step back, to disappear, to run, but Ethan's hand remained steady at her side, grounding her in place. "Remember," he said quietly, finally turning to look at her, his eyes unreadable but steady. "They're watching for you to break." Lily met his gaze, something inside her settling. Not confidence, not yet, but something quieter, stronger. Resolve. Because for the first time since she stepped into that room, she realized something no one else seemed to understand. She might not belong to their world, but that didn't mean she was smaller than it. And whatever was about to happen next, she wasn't going to be the one who flinched. The silence did not last long. It never does in rooms like this. Within seconds, the whispers began, soft at first, like a ripple across water, but growing sharper as eyes followed Ethan and Lily deeper into the reception hall. "Ethan Cole, is that really him?" someone murmured near the bar. "I thought he would not show after everything." "Who is she?" another voice asked, quieter but far more curious. Lily felt each word without hearing them directly, like pressure against her skin, but she kept her chin level, her steps measured, remembering exactly what Ethan had said. "Do not flinch." They passed a group of women dressed in sleek designer gowns, their smiles polite, but their eyes anything but welcoming. One of them tilted her head slightly, lips curving just enough to suggest amusement. "Interesting choice," she said softly, not even bothering to lower her voice. Lily almost glanced down at her dress again, almost let that old instinct take over, the one that told her she was out of place, but instead she kept her gaze forward. If they were waiting for discomfort, she would not give it to them. Ethan guided her toward the center of the room where the energy shifted subtly, where conversations slowed and space opened just enough to acknowledge his presence without anyone having to say it out loud. This was his world, not hers. But tonight, he had brought her into it, and whether she understood why or not, she was standing in it now. "You are doing fine," he said quietly, his tone even, but there was something else underneath it now, something less distant, almost approving. Lily let out a slow breath she had not realized she was holding. "I feel like I am being evaluated," she replied under her breath. "You are," he said simply. "Everyone here is." That did not help, but strangely it steadied her. Because if everyone was being judged, then maybe she was not as alone in this as she felt. A server approached again, offering champagne, and this time Ethan took 2 glasses, handing one to her without breaking stride. Lily hesitated for half a second before accepting it, her fingers brushing the cool stem, grounding herself in something tangible. Across the room, the bride had not looked away. Victoria Hayes stood perfectly poised, her posture flawless, her expression carefully composed, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. This was not part of her plan. Not tonight. Not with him. Lily could feel it without needing to understand the full history between them. Whatever had happened before, whatever had broken between Ethan and Victoria, it was not finished. And now she was standing right in the middle of it. "She is coming," Ethan said quietly. Lily followed his gaze as Victoria began walking toward them, each step controlled, deliberate, her smile returning just enough to be polite, just enough to hide whatever storm was building underneath. The room seemed to shift again, attention narrowing, conversations fading into the background as if everyone sensed something was about to happen. Lily's grip on the glass tightened slightly, but she did not step back. Not this time. Victoria stopped just a few feet away, her eyes locking onto Ethan first, searching, calculating, then sliding to Lily with a calm that felt far too practiced. "Ethan," she said, her voice smooth, almost warm. "I did not expect you to come." Her gaze flicked back to Lily, lingering just a moment longer than necessary. "And you brought company." The pause was intentional, measured, designed. Lily felt it, the subtle edge beneath the politeness, the invitation to shrink, to explain, to justify her presence. But instead, she did something different. She smiled. Not overly bright, not forced, just enough to acknowledge the moment without surrendering to it. "Yes," Lily said calmly, meeting Victoria's gaze without hesitation. "He did." And for the first time since she stepped into that room, the silence that followed did not belong to them. It belonged to her. Victoria's smile held, but only just, the kind of composure built over years of knowing exactly how to win a room without ever raising her voice. And for a brief moment, no one moved, no one spoke, as if the entire space was waiting to see who would break first. But Ethan did not step in. He did not soften the moment or redirect it. He simply stood there beside Lily, silent, letting the weight of the situation settle exactly where it was. And that alone said more than anything he could have said out loud. Because in a room like this, silence was never empty. It was deliberate, calculated, powerful, and Victoria understood that better than anyone, her gaze flickering back to Ethan, searching for something familiar, something predictable, but finding none of it, which only made her smile sharpen ever so slightly. "Well," she said, tilting her head with effortless grace, "I suppose surprises are part of the evening." Her eyes returning to Lily, scanning again, this time slower, more intentional, as if she were trying to place her, categorize her, define her worth in a matter of seconds. "And what is it that you do?" The question sounded polite, but it was not curiosity. It was positioning, a subtle invitation for Lily to reveal exactly where she stood in comparison to everyone else in the room. And Lily knew it. She felt the trap in the simplicity of it, the expectation that she would either shrink or overcompensate. But instead she answered plainly, "I work at a coffee shop," her voice steady, calm, without apology. And for a fraction of a second, the air shifted again, because that was not the answer anyone expected her to give so directly, a quiet ripple of reaction passing through the nearby guests, some amused, some intrigued, some clearly dismissive, and Victoria's lips curved just a touch more, not quite a smile, not quite anything kind. "How refreshing," she said smoothly, the word carrying just enough weight to draw attention without appearing cruel. But the message was clear. You do not belong here. And this time, Ethan moved, just slightly, his posture adjusting, not defensive, not aggressive, but present in a way that was impossible to ignore. She is with me, he said, his tone even, controlled, but firm enough to cut through the undercurrent of judgment without escalating it. And that should have been enough. In most rooms it would have been more than enough. But this was not most rooms. And Victoria was not most people. She let out a soft, almost amused breath, glancing briefly at the guests around them before returning her attention to Lily. Of course she is, she said, her voice warm again, almost friendly now, which somehow made it sharper. I am just curious how someone like you ended up here tonight. And there it was, not an insult, not directly, but a question designed to make Lily explain herself, justify her place, prove that she deserved to stand where she was standing. And for a split second, Lily felt it again, that old instinct to step back, to minimize, to say something safe, something that would make the tension disappear. But then she remembered the coffee shop, the early mornings, the long hours, the way she had built something small but real with her own hands, something honest, something hers. And suddenly, the room did not feel quite as intimidating as it had moments ago, because value did not only exist in places like this, it existed in effort, in kindness, in quiet resilience. And she lifted her chin just slightly, meeting Victoria's gaze without hesitation. I was invited, Lily said simply, her voice calm, grounded, not defensive, not proud, just true. And for the first time, Victoria's expression faltered, not dramatically, not enough for most people to notice, but enough for the shift to register in the space between them, because that answer did not play by the rules she had set. It did not apologize, it did not explain, it did not ask for permission. It simply existed, and that, more than anything else, unsettled the balance of the room. Even if no one said it out loud. The shift in the room did not go unnoticed, not by the guests who thrived on subtle power plays, and certainly not by Victoria, whose expression recovered almost instantly, her composure snapping back into place like it had never wavered at all. But something had changed, something small yet undeniable, and the way her eyes lingered on Lily now carried less certainty and more calculation, as if she were reassessing a situation that was no longer as predictable as she had assumed. Well, she said lightly, smoothing an invisible crease on her dress, then I suppose we should all make our guests feel welcome. And with that, she turned slightly, gesturing toward a nearby group of elegantly dressed individuals. You must join us. The invitation was polite, expected, but the tone beneath it suggested something else entirely, a stage being set rather than a courtesy being extended. And before Lily could respond, Ethan gave a subtle nod, guiding her forward once more, not forcing, just steady, as if he trusted her to hold her own now, which somehow felt more daunting than reassuring. The group they approached fell quiet as they arrived, their attention sharp, curious, the kind of attention that did not miss details, and Lily felt it again, the weight of being observed. But this time, it did not press down on her the same way, because she had already crossed the hardest part. She had already chosen not to step back. Everyone, Victoria said smoothly, her voice carrying just enough to draw in a wider circle of listeners. This is, she paused, just for a fraction of a second, long enough to make the absence of a name noticeable, deliberate. I do not believe I caught your name. And there it was again, another test, smaller, sharper, designed to see if Lily would stumble, if she would shrink under the pressure of being put on display. But Lily did not hesitate. Lily Carter, she said clearly, her voice steady, meeting each curious glance without lowering her gaze. And the name hung there for a moment, simple, unpolished, real, contrasting against the polished introductions that usually filled rooms like this. Lily, Victoria repeated, her smile returning, though her eyes remained intent. And you work at a coffee shop. The repetition was not accidental. It was emphasis, a way to anchor Lily's identity in something the room could easily categorize, something smaller, something safe to dismiss. A few quiet chuckles rippled through the group, not loud enough to be overtly rude, but present enough to be felt. And for a second, the old instinct flickered again, the urge to explain, to justify, to make herself easier for them to accept. But then Lily noticed something else, something subtle but important. Ethan had gone completely still beside her, not tense, not intervening, just watching, not the room, not Victoria, but her, as if this moment was hers to claim or lose, and that realization shifted something deeper inside her. Because this was not just about fitting in anymore. It was about whether she would let them define her, or whether she would define herself, and slowly, she set her glass down on a nearby table, freeing her hands, grounding herself in the decision she was about to make. Yes, Lily said, her voice calm but carrying just enough to reach beyond the immediate circle. I work at a coffee shop, she paused, just briefly, not for effect, but for truth. I open at 5:30 every morning. I remember regulars by name. I know exactly how someone takes their coffee before they even ask, and I make sure they leave feeling a little better than when they walked in. The room quieted, not dramatically, but noticeably, the soft background noise dipping just enough for her words to land. It is not glamorous, she continued, her tone even, unashamed. But it matters, and that was it. No defense, no apology, no attempt to elevate it into something it was not. Just a simple statement of value. And for a moment, no one responded, not because they did not have opinions, but because the response they expected to provoke had not come, and in its place was something far more difficult to dismiss, something grounded, something real. And as the silence stretched, Lily felt something unexpected settle in her chest. Not fear, not even nerves anymore, but a quiet certainty, because for the first time since she walked into that room, she was no longer trying to belong there. She was simply standing in who she already was. And that, more than anything else, was what made the room hesitate. The silence that followed did not break all at once. It shifted, like a room adjusting to something it did not expect but could not ignore. And then, slowly, a few subtle reactions surfaced. A raised brow here, a glance exchanged there, the kind of quiet recalibration that happens when a narrative people thought they understood no longer fits. And Victoria noticed it immediately. Of course she did, her gaze sweeping across the group, reading the room with practiced precision before returning to Lily, her smile still intact, but no longer as effortless as it had been moments ago. That is admirable, she said, her tone measured, carefully neutral. But there was a slight pause before the word admirable, just enough to reveal that she had not planned for this direction, that Lily's answer had disrupted the script she was trying to control, and for a brief moment, no one spoke, because there was nothing obvious to dismiss, nothing exaggerated to criticize, just a simple truth that did not bend under pressure, and that made it harder to challenge, harder to reduce, harder to win against, and Ethan saw it. The way the balance had shifted, the way Lily had stepped into the space without asking for permission, and something in his expression changed, subtle but unmistakable, not surprise exactly, but recognition, like he was seeing something he had not expected to matter this much, and yet it did, more than anything else in the room. "Excuse me," a new voice cut in smoothly, drawing attention just enough to redirect the tension without dissolving it. A tall man in a tailored suit stepping forward, his presence confident, familiar to the guests around him. "Victoria, they are ready for you." His tone respectful, but his eyes flickered briefly toward Ethan, then Lily, curiosity lingering beneath the surface, and Victoria's posture straightened just slightly, the role of bride settling back over her like armor, polished, composed, untouchable. "Of course," she replied, her voice regaining its full confidence as she turned back to Ethan one last time. "Enjoy the evening," she added, her gaze lingering for just a second longer than necessary, not on him this time, but on Lily, as if committing something to memory, something unresolved, before she turned and walked away, the room gradually breathing again as conversations resumed, though quieter now, more aware, more cautious, because something had shifted that could not be undone, and as the attention dispersed, Lily felt the tension in her shoulders release just enough for her to notice it had been there all along, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table where she had set her glass, grounding herself again in something real, something steady. "You handled that," Ethan said beside her, his voice lower now, less performative, more personal, and when she glanced up at him, she noticed the difference immediately. The distance he had maintained earlier was not as sharp, not as deliberate. I just told the truth, Lily replied, her tone simple, but there was a quiet strength in it now that had not been there before, not because she had changed in those few minutes, but because she had stopped trying to adjust herself to fit a room that was never built for her. And Ethan studied her for a moment, longer than necessary, as if trying to understand something beyond what she had said, something about the way she stood, the way she did not bend under pressure, the way she did not try to become someone else to survive a moment. And for the first time that night, he looked less like a man controlling a situation and more like someone reconsidering it. Most people would have played it differently, he said quietly, not as a criticism, but as an observation, and Lily gave a small, almost amused breath, her gaze drifting briefly across the room before returning to him. Most people here probably do not have a choice, she said, and that landed in a way neither of them fully expected, because in a room built on image and expectation, authenticity was not just rare, it was disruptive, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the noise of the reception filling the space around them again. But something had changed, something quieter than the tension from before, something that did not demand attention but held it anyway, because whatever this arrangement was supposed to be, whatever role Lily had agreed to play for the night, it was no longer as simple as pretending, not for her, and not for him. The music swelled gently from the far end of the hall as the ceremony transitioned into its next phase, the soft clinking of glasses and low hum of conversation returning to something that almost resembled normal, but Lily could still feel it beneath the surface, the awareness. The glances that lingered just a little too long before turning away, the quiet curiosity that had not disappeared, only shifted into something more careful, and as she stood there beside Ethan, she realized that whatever had just happened between her and Victoria had not ended. It had only changed form. "Come with me," Ethan said quietly, his voice cutting through her thoughts as he gestured subtly toward a set of tall glass doors that led out onto a balcony overlooking the city, and without waiting for a response, he guided her through the crowd, past clusters of guests who parted instinctively at his presence, until the air changed, cooler, quieter, the noise of the reception fading into a distant backdrop as they stepped outside, the city lights stretching endlessly below them like a living map of everything this world represented: ambition, success, power, and distance. And for the first time since she had arrived, Lily let out a breath that felt completely her own, her shoulders lowering slightly as the tension eased. "You needed that," Ethan said, not as a question, but as an observation, and she gave a small nod, resting her hands lightly against the cool railing, grounding herself in the steady presence of something real, something that did not judge or measure or expect anything from her. "Is it always like that?" she asked after a moment, her voice softer now, less guarded. "Rooms like this," Ethan replied, stepping beside her, his gaze fixed out over the skyline. "Yes." And there was no hesitation in his answer, no attempt to soften it or make it sound easier than it was, just a simple truth delivered without decoration. And Lily studied him for a moment, noticing the difference again, the way he carried himself out here compared to inside, less calculated, less controlled, like the version of him that existed beyond the expectations of people like Victoria and everyone else in that room. "Then why bring me?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could reconsider it, not accusing, just honest. And for the first time since she had met him, Ethan did not answer immediately, his silence stretching just long enough to feel intentional, like he was choosing his words rather than relying on the ones that came easiest. "Because you would not play their game," he said finally, his voice quieter now, more personal. And Lily blinked slightly, caught off guard by the directness of it. "You did not know that," she replied, and he shook his head just slightly, the faintest hint of something almost like a smile touching his expression. "I did," he said, "the moment you said yes without asking what you would get out of it." And that landed in a way she had not expected, because she had not thought of it that way. She had not thought of herself as someone who stood out in any particular way. She had just reacted, agreed, stepped into something unfamiliar without fully understanding why. And now, standing here with the city stretching out beneath them, she began to see it differently, not as a mistake, not as something accidental, but as a choice, one that had led her here, into a world that was not hers, but that she had not run from. "You brought me here to prove something," she said slowly, more to herself than to him. And Ethan's gaze shifted, not denying it, not confirming it outright, but not dismissing it either. "Maybe," he said. And there it was again, that partial truth, that space between what was said and what was not, and Lily felt it settle in her chest, the realization forming quietly, steadily, that whatever this arrangement was supposed to be, whatever role she thought she was playing tonight, there was more to it than he had told her, more than he had explained. And for the first time since she had walked into that room, the uncertainty did not come from the people around her, it came from him. The air outside had felt clearer, almost honest, but the moment the glass doors opened again and the sound of the reception poured back in, Lily felt it return, that subtle pressure, that invisible weight of expectation, and this time it settled differently, not on her shoulders, but somewhere deeper, because now she was not just questioning the room, she was questioning him. And as they stepped back inside, Ethan's hand rested briefly at her back again, guiding her forward, steady, familiar. But something about it felt different now, not grounding, not reassuring, just present, and Lily noticed it, the way she did not lean into it the same way she had before, the way her steps were slightly more deliberate, more her own, as if she were no longer following his lead but walking beside him by choice, or maybe in spite of it. The reception had shifted into speeches, soft applause rippling through the room as guests gathered closer to the center, and Victoria stood near the front, radiant once again, her earlier tension smoothed over into something polished and controlled. But when her eyes briefly met Lily's across the room, there was no warmth there, only awareness, only recognition, like she had already adjusted her strategy, like she was waiting for something else to unfold. And Lily felt it again, that quiet warning beneath the surface, that whatever had started earlier was not finished, not even close. "Stay close," Ethan murmured again. But this time, Lily did not immediately respond, her gaze lingering on him for a fraction of a second longer than before, searching, measuring, and for the first time, questioning, and he felt it. Of course he did. The shift was too subtle for anyone else, but not for him, his expression tightening just slightly, not in frustration, but in awareness, like he knew exactly what she was beginning to see, and neither of them said anything about it. Not yet, because the moment did not allow for it. The room was watching again, attention slowly circling back toward them as whispers reignited, quieter this time, more curious than dismissive, but still present, still sharp. And then it happened. Not loud, not dramatic, just a voice from behind them, smooth, deliberate, cutting through the noise with just enough precision to draw attention without seeming obvious. "You know," the voice began, a woman stepping slightly closer into the edge of their space, her expression composed, her tone almost conversational. "It is impressive, really." And Lily turned just enough to acknowledge her, recognizing the same group from earlier, the same polished faces, the same quiet judgments wrapped in polite smiles. "Coming into a room like this," the woman continued, her eyes flicking briefly to Ethan before returning to Lily, "without knowing how things work." And there it was, not an outright insult, not even direct, but clear enough, a reopening of the test, a second attempt. And this time, it was not Victoria leading it, it was the room itself, picking up where she had left off. And Lily felt the difference immediately, because this was not just one person challenging her. It was the environment, the unspoken rules, the expectations she was never meant to meet. And for a moment, the doubt returned, quieter, but still there, whispering that maybe she had misunderstood something. Maybe she had stepped into a role she was never meant to hold. And then she glanced at Ethan, just for a second, expecting something, an explanation, a reassurance. Anything that would clarify what this was supposed to be. But he did not speak. He did not interrupt. He simply watched her. Again, the same way he had before, letting the moment rest entirely in her hands. And that was when it clicked. Not all at once, but enough. Enough for the truth to begin forming in a way she could not ignore anymore. This was never just about attending a wedding. It was never just about pretending. This was a test, not of the room, not even of her, but of something he needed to prove. Something she had been brought into without fully understanding. And the realization landed quietly, but heavily, because suddenly, every look, every question, Every moment of pressure made sense in a way it had not before, and without thinking, Lily took a small step back. Not dramatic, not enough to draw attention, but enough to create space, not between her and the room, but between her and him. And when she spoke, her voice was still calm, still steady, but there was something new in it now, something sharper, something that had not been there before. "Maybe I do not," she said simply, meeting the woman's gaze without hesitation. "But I am starting to understand." The words lingered in the air longer than they should have, not because they were loud, but because they landed exactly where they needed to. And for a moment, the woman who had spoken seemed unsure how to respond, her polite smile holding but no longer as effortless as before, while a few nearby guests exchanged subtle glances, sensing that something had shifted again, something small but undeniable. And this time, it was not just about curiosity or quiet judgment. It was about tension, real tension, the kind that does not come from status or wealth, but from truth being spoken in a place that is not used to hearing it. And Lily felt it, the way the atmosphere changed around her, not closing in, but opening slightly, as if the room itself was adjusting to her presence rather than the other way around. And for the first time since she stepped inside, she was not reacting, she was choosing. "Understanding what?" the woman asked finally, her tone still smooth, but now edged with something sharper, something more direct. And Lily did not rush her answer. She did not look to Ethan. She did not soften her posture. She simply stood there, grounded in the realization that had been building since the moment she walked into this place, that this was never about fitting in. She said calmly, her voice steady but clear enough to carry beyond the immediate circle. It was about seeing who would bend first. And that did it. Not a dramatic reaction, not an outburst, but a silence that spread just far enough to draw attention. Conversations nearby dipping as a few more heads turned, drawn by something they could not quite name but could feel. And the woman's expression shifted again, this time more noticeably, because the game she had been playing no longer had the same rules. And before she could respond, before the moment could be redirected or diluted, another voice entered, softer, but far more deliberate. "She is right," Ethan said. And that changed everything, not because of what he said, but because of where he said it, out loud, in front of them, in front of everyone who was now paying attention. His tone calm, controlled, but unmistakably firm, and Lily felt it beside her, the shift in him, no longer observing, no longer allowing the situation to unfold without interference. He had stepped in, fully, publicly, and the room reacted instantly, subtle but immediate, because this was not how it was supposed to go, not for him, not in a setting like this. And Victoria noticed too. Of course she did, her attention snapping back toward them from across the room, her posture still composed, but her focus sharp, precise. "This was my decision," Ethan continued, his gaze moving briefly across the small group before settling back on Lily. Not possessive, not performative, just certain. "And if there is any confusion about why she is here, that is on me, not her." And that should have ended it. In most situations, it would have. But the weight of what he had just done did not disappear that easily, because he had not just defended her, he had shifted the narrative entirely, taking the unspoken hierarchy that governed the room and tilting it in a way no one had expected. And Lily felt it, not as relief, not as validation, but as clarity, because now there was no doubt left, no ambiguity, no space to pretend this was something simple, something harmless. This had always been more than that. And slowly, she turned her head toward him, her gaze steady, searching, and for the first time, she did not see the distance, the calculation, or the control. She saw something else, something quieter, something that had been there beneath it all, but had not been spoken until now. And when she spoke, her voice was softer than before, but it carried just as much weight. "You should have told me," she said, not accusing, not angry, just honest. And the words settled between them in a way that no one else in the room could fully understand, but everyone could feel, because whatever had been building throughout the night had finally surfaced, not as a confrontation, but as a truth neither of them could step away from anymore. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow down to just the space between them, the noise of the reception fading into something distant and irrelevant, as if the entire room had taken a step back without realizing it. and Ethan did not look away. Not this time. Not like before when silence had been his shield, because now there was no shield left, only the truth he had chosen to step into. And the weight of her words settled on him in a way nothing else that night had. "You are right," he said. Finally, his voice lower now, stripped of the control he had carried so effortlessly earlier. And that alone was enough to shift the moment again, because men like Ethan Cole did not admit that easily, not in rooms like this, not in front of people who were watching for any sign of weakness. But he did not look at them. He did not look at Victoria. He only looked at Lily. "I should have told you," he continued, and there was no excuse in it, no justification, just a simple acknowledgement that landed with more weight than any explanation could have, and Lily felt it. Not as something that erased what had happened, but as something real, something that did not try to hide behind status or control. And for the first time since she stepped into that room, the tension inside her shifted, not gone, but clearer, more defined. "Then why did you not?" she asked softly. And this time, he did not hesitate. "Because I did not think it would matter," he said. And there it was, the truth beneath everything. Not cruel, not intentional, but honest in a way that revealed more than he probably meant to. And Lily held his gaze, letting the words settle, understanding them for what they were, not just about tonight, but about how he saw the world, how he moved through it, how he decided what mattered and what did not. And slowly, she nodded, not in agreement, but in recognition. "It mattered to me," she said, her voice calm, steady, and that was not a rejection, not an accusation. Just a boundary drawn quietly but firmly, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to hide behind, no role to play, no performance to maintain, just two people standing in the middle of a room that no longer defined the moment the way it had before. And then, something unexpected happened, not from Ethan, not from Lily, but from the room itself, because the attention that had been circling them shifted again, not away, but closer. Not out of judgment this time, but something else, something quieter, something almost like respect, because what they were witnessing was no longer a spectacle. It was something real, something that did not fit neatly into the expectations they were used to. And even Victoria, standing at the front of the room, watched without interruption, her expression unreadable now, not cold, not warm, just still, as if she understood that whatever had just unfolded was no longer hers to control. And Lily took a small breath, feeling the weight of the night settle into something she could finally carry. Not perfectly, not easily, but honestly. And she glanced around the room one last time. The chandeliers, the polished floors, the people who had once made her feel small, and realized something simple but undeniable. None of it had changed, but she had, not in who she was, but in how she stood in it. And when she looked back at Ethan, her expression softened just slightly, not because everything was resolved, but because something real had begun. "Next time," she said quietly, a hint of something almost like a smile touching her voice. "No pretending." And Ethan let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, the tension in his posture easing just enough to show it. And he nodded once, not as a businessman sealing a deal, not as a man controlling a situation, but as someone choosing something without knowing exactly where it would lead. "No pretending," he repeated, and this time, it was not a condition, it was a promise. And as the music rose again and the night continued around them, the moment did not disappear, it stayed, quiet, steady, the beginning of something that did not need the room's approval to exist.